Imagine a city where everyone knows each other, where secrets seem small but are actually buried deep, controlling everyone's lives. Now imagine that a single man, a journalist, manages to expose these secrets, risking everything to reveal the truth. What would happen when the lie is exposed and the forces that control the city turn against him? This is the story of Jonathan Miller, a man willing to face the greatest threat of all, the truth. Prepare for a journey of mystery, tension, and revelations. What would you do in his place? In 1881, the United States was undergoing a period of rapid transformation. The country was recovering from the Civil War, and the West was still an unexplored land, full of mysteries, opportunities, and also untold tragedies. The Industrial Revolution was on the rise, and large cities were beginning to flourish, but at the same time, small towns in the interior of the country remained isolated, on the margins of the great changes happening in Washington. The small town of Aberdeen, located in the state of Carolina do Sul, was one of those places. With a small population and a simple community life, the town seemed to be the kind of place where everyone knew each other and nothing happened without everyone knowing. But Aberdeen held a secret, something that was about to be discovered by the young man, Jonathan Miller, a 25-year-old journalist with sharp ambition and an inquisitive eye, was searching for a big scoop for his career. Coming from a larger, more cosmopolitan city, he saw Aberdeen as a temporary stop, a place that, in his mind, held nothing extraordinary. But everything changed when he heard about Mary Elms, a woman whose story was beginning to take center stage in the city. Mary Elms was no ordinary person in Aberdeen. She was a strong-willed woman, known for her work as a teacher at the local school. However, after a mysterious event that occurred on a stormy night, her life would never be the same. She became a shadow of her former self, a woman who avoided conversation, walked the streets with a blank expression, and, strangest of all, whispered things that no one could understand. Her story was spread throughout the city, but no one knew exactly what had happened to her. Jonathan, curious and with the perspicacity of a young journalist thirsty for stories, soon heard rumors about what Mary Elms had witnessed. Something had happened that night, something the locals whispered about in secret, as if afraid to speak aloud. Some said she had been tested by the wild nature of the town. Others believed she had seen something supernatural, while a smaller group believed that the social oppression and mental repression of the time had left her mind shattered. Jonathan's newspaper had been the gateway to this story, but as he delved deeper, he discovered a city that seemed to hide much more than just the story of a traumatized woman. Sheriff John Owens, a respected and feared figure, seemed to know more than he let on. A robust man with piercing eyes, Owens never seemed concerned about what happened in the streets or fields around the city. However, whenever someone mentioned Mary Elms's name or what she had experienced, he visibly tensed. Owens, more than anyone, knew what had happened that night, but his silence seemed to protect something far darker. When Jonathan finally attended one of the city's most exclusive meetings, a private gathering of local officials, he overheard something that made his stomach churn. Amid discussions about security and the economy, someone whispered about a kind of forbidden witness, a figure who had been silenced and whose testimony had been denied or hidden to protect the city's good order. Jonathan didn't know what that meant, but his journalistic instincts told him he was close to uncovering something big. The mystery of Mary Elms was beginning to take a form Jonathan could never have imagined. He not only had to discover what had happened to her that fateful night, but also understand the role that the social, political, and even economic oppression of an isolated town might have played in creating such a well-kept secret. The stories of other residents began to intertwine, and a tale of repression and social control took shape. What seemed to be a simple story of psychological trauma and social oppression soon transformed into something far larger and more complex than he could have anticipated. The crucial element that stood out to Jonathan was the idea that perhaps what Mary Elms had witnessed was not something supernatural, but a representation of the dark forces of human oppression. A plot of control, manipulation, and silence that ruled that small town with an invisible fist. The conflict wasn't just in the shadows that haunted the city, but in the actions of the residents themselves who, out of fear or convenience, preferred to keep the lie going. Now Jonathan faced a dilemma. Could he, as a journalist, expose what he knew, or would he fall into the same web of omissions that imprisoned the city? He knew that the answers he sought could be dangerous, but as a journalist in search of the truth, he had no choice but to dig deeper. Oppression, in this case, it wasn't just a matter of social or economic power. It was an invisible force shaping the choices, the silences, and the lives of everyone in Aberdeen. Something was happening there, something no one could fully understand, but which Jonathan now felt was at the heart of the problem. Do you believe that the mysteries of a small town can be more complex than they seem? What do you think happened that night to Mary Elms? Leave your theories in the comments. Jonathan Miller spent his days in Aberdeen with a mixture of fascination and unease. The city, with its tranquil facade, hid layers of secrets that the journalist was beginning to uncover. But what intrigued him most was not the mystery behind Mary Elms. It was the city itself and its inhabitants, who seemed to carry an invisible weight, as if they were ready to crumble at any moment. Aberdeen was not just a town in the American heartland. It had a history, a foundation shaped by centuries of tradition and oppression. The hot, humid southern climate, combined with the surrounding cotton fields, created a perfect setting for what was happening there, a place where the echoes of the colonial past and slavery still lingered in the air, invisible but tangible. Jonathan couldn't help but notice how the city was marked by social division. Even at the end of the 19th century, racial segregation was still a strong reality. The city seemed divided in two, with whites living in the central areas where businesses and commerce were located, while blacks occupied the peripheral neighborhoods further away from public view. But there was something deeper to it, something not visible at first glance, as if racism wasn't just a matter of color, but a power structure that transcended ethnicity and permeated all aspects of life in Aberdeen. Walking through the streets of Aberdeen, Jonathan could feel the stares. They weren't just curious, but heavy, as if he were an intruder, someone who shouldn't be there. The feeling of unease intensified when he visited the small central square where the Hall of Justice was located there. This was the meeting point for local authorities, including the Sheriff Owens, the man who seemed to dominate the city with his imposing presence. Was not just a police officer. He was the city's keeper of silence, a figure whose words were always measured and who rarely showed vulnerability. What Jonathan began to understand was that the city was more subject to a rigid structure of social control than he had imagined. The local police, represented by the sheriff, had a role beyond simply enforcing the law. They were the protectors of a system of silent oppression, where the rules were dictated by those who held power and status. For many residents, the idea of questioning this power was unthinkable. Even the most daring, those who tried to challenge the status quo, were quickly silenced, either by fear or by the subtle repression that hung in the air. Before her tragic incident, Mary Elms was seen as someone who stood out from the others. The daughter of a respectable town family, she possessed a solid education and an independent spirit. But after what happened, she became a strange figure, someone who walked through town as if carrying an invisible weight. She avoided eye contact and conversation, spending her days immersed in a profound silence that the townspeople couldn't comprehend. Her eyes were empty, as if she had lost something essential, or perhaps as if she had seen something that should have remained hidden. Jonathan, in his investigations, found a crucial point: the collective silence. The residents seemed to refuse to talk about what had happened to Mary. He tried to speak with Mary's old friends, but they all seemed wary and uncomfortable with the idea of talking about her. When he mentioned her name, there was a slight trembling of their hands, a shifting of their gaze, and a quick change of subject. What Jonathan didn't know was that, before this happened, Mary had been tested in an unimaginable way. She had become involved with a circle of influential people in the city, some of whom were respectable figures with deep ties to local political and economic power. Jonathan had learned of a secret meeting Mary had witnessed, where some of the city's most powerful figures were engaged in discussions about how to maintain order and silence any dissenting voices. What she had learned at that meeting was a truth far more disturbing than any of the stories he had heard. The truth, Jonathan began to realize, was that the city's power system was sustained by a fragile balance, where oppression and fear were deeply ingrained. Each of the residents, even the richest and most powerful, carried a kind of collective guilt, a guilt for the survival of a system that stifled those who dared to question it. Mary's case was no exception. It was a reflection of something much larger. The most shocking thing of all was the role of Sheriff Owens. Jonathan quickly realized that the sheriff was more connected to what had happened to Mary than he had initially imagined. Owens knew exactly what had happened that night and was doing everything he could to keep the town in the dark. The sheriff was not only protecting the town and its secret, but also protecting the people at the center of the web of oppression. Jonathan knew that to fully uncover what had happened to Mary, he would need to break the silence imposed by these powerful figures. But he also knew that this could cost him much more than just his journalistic credibility. The pressure on him was mounting, but he couldn't afford to stop now. Do you think the city of Aberdeen is truly being controlled by a silent power network? What do you think Jonathan will find as he delves deeper into his investigations? Leave your opinions and theories in the comments. As the days passed in Aberdeen, Jonathan Miller felt he was delving into something far more dangerous than he had imagined. Each piece of information he gathered seemed to add a new layer of complexity to the mystery surrounding Mary Elms. This was no longer just an isolated case of oppression, but something far more deeply rooted and dangerous to the very essence of the city. What he was beginning to discover was that the conflict was not merely between the past and the present, but between those who wanted to maintain power at all costs and those who, like Mary, were silenced by the force of fear. Jonathan now had a list of names, influential people whose faces seemed harmless, but whose actions fueled the network of control that dominated Aberdeen. He had managed to get a meeting with Henry Waller, a local lawyer and long-time ally of Sheriff Owens, whose position of power gave him access to a network of resources he used to ensure the city continued to run like a well-oiled machine. Waller, a stylish and well-dressed man, seemed to know that Jonathan was getting close to the truth, and this made the tension rise with every word spoken. In his conversation with Waller, Jonathan realized that the lawyer used carefully chosen words. He never directly stated what he meant, but there was always an underlying veil of threats, a warning for Jonathan to stop digging. "Aberdeen is a peaceful and orderly town," Waller had said with a gentle smile. "There's no reason to disturb the peace with old and irrelevant matters." But Jonathan knew those words were a warning, not just to him, but to anyone who dared question what had happened that night. The net was closing in. Jonathan could feel the city's eyes on him, and with each step he took, the residents seemed more distant, more suspicious. What he didn't know was that the inhabitants themselves were being forced to remain silent, not because they wanted to protect a secret, but because they were terrified of the consequences of talking too much. On a visit to Ellen Harper, Ellen, one of Mary's few friends who still lived in Aberdeen, was confronted with a new piece of the puzzle. Ellen, a woman with a tired appearance and sad eyes, was reluctant to talk about what Mary had experienced. She hesitated for a long time before finally opening up, as if she were handing something precious to Jonathan. "She was never the same after that night," Ellen said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "Mary knew something she shouldn't have known, and the others simply ignored her. Or worse, they kept her in place, never allowing her to speak." Ellen paused, her gaze distant. "I know you're trying to understand, Jonathan, but there are things you don't know, things no one can tell you." Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in Ellen's words that made him think she knew far more than she was willing to admit. Mary had been tested, but how? What did she know? And why did no one but her seem to have noticed the depth of the oppression hanging over the city? That night, Jonathan met with the Sheriff Owenson, one of Aberdeen's most secluded bars. The meeting was discreet, but Jonathan knew Owens was aware of everything that was going on. The sheriff, with his impenetrable gaze, seemed to be waiting for Jonathan to get straight to the point. "You're getting yourself into something very big, kid," Owens said, with a frightening calm. "Aberdeen isn't a place for those who seek to stir up the bones of the past. Sometimes it's better to leave things as they are." The tension between them was becoming palpable. Jonathan knew Owens was trying to intimidate him, but he also understood that the sheriff was trying to protect something much bigger than he imagined. The town, which seemed small and isolated, was a microcosm of something much larger, a place where power was in the hands of a few and where the truth was constantly distorted to maintain order. Most disturbing of all, however, was that Jonathan was beginning to realize that the townspeople themselves were being manipulated. He had learned of an ancient pact made between the most powerful figures in Aberdeen, a pact of silence and compliance. They controlled not only information, but also the actions of everyone around them. When Jonathan first heard about the pact, he didn't want to believe it, but with each passing day, he saw the truth unfold before his eyes. Jonathan's investigations were beginning to reveal a city marked not only by a simple incident, but by a network of oppression and control. Each new detail he uncovered seemed to deepen the mystery even further, and as he got closer to the truth, the danger increased. Jonathan's challenges were only beginning. He knew that to solve Mary's case, he would need to confront not only the powerful of Aberdeen, but also the ghosts of the city's own past. What was being covered up was far deeper than he had imagined, and with each step he found himself more entangled in a web of lies and betrayals. Do you think Jonathan is getting closer to the truth, or is he putting himself at risk by investigating further? What are your suspicions about the pact that controls Aberdeen? Leave your theories in the comments. As Jonathan Miller delved deeper into the mystery of Aberdeen, the scenario around him became increasingly complex. What he initially believed to be a simple case of social oppression and the repression of a single woman, Mary Elms, was transforming into something much larger. Aberdeen was not just a city where power was concentrated in the hands of a few. It was a microcosm of manipulation, control, and secrets that kept the city in constant tension. But, beyond the main plot, other subplots began to emerge, each contributing to the dark picture Jonathan was trying to piece together. One of these subplots involved Eliza Parsons, Eliza, a young teacher who, like Mary Elms, seemed dissatisfied with the city's situation, but who, unlike Mary, had not yet been silenced. Eliza was known for her progressive views and the way she challenged Aberdeen's social norms. She spoke openly about education for all, without distinction of race or class, and believed the city needed change. But with each speech she gave, she saw resistance grow around her. And like Mary, the shadow of oppression seemed to haunt her, as local authorities began to feel threatened by her growing popularity. In his conversations with Eliza, Jonathan began to realize that the young teacher knew far more than she was willing to reveal. She was talking about changes that could happen in Aberdeen, but vaguely, as if she feared the consequences of delving deeper. Eliza seemed torn between wanting to challenge the system and being afraid of what that might mean for her safety and that of her family. Jonathan tried to press her to give him more information about the resistance, but Eliza always avoided the subject, making him wonder if she had something to hide. Another relevant subplot was linked to Thomas More Thomas, a farmer who for many years had been a defender of the status quo. Unlike many Aberdeen residents, owned valuable land, and his family had always had close ties with Sheriff Owens and other influential members of the town. However, in recent months, something seemed to have changed. Thomas had begun to distance himself from the circles of power, and his behavior had become increasingly erratic. Some people said he had begun to question the town's practices, and even Sheriff Owens himself, but no one knew for sure if this was true. Determined to understand what was happening with Thomas, Jonathan visited his farm. The man, normally rigid and calculating, was visibly disturbed. His eyes, once confident and steady, now seemed vague and restless, as if he were hiding something very big. Thomas greeted Jonathan with a forced smile and led him into the living room, where the conversation began cordially. But soon, tension settled in. "I'm not a man of big words, Jonathan," Thomas said, looking at him with a seriousness that made him uncomfortable. "I know you're investigating the city. I know what you're trying to do." He paused, observing Jonathan's reaction. "But don't expect to find something that will make you feel comfortable. There are things that, once you know them, can't be undone, and you might end up getting hurt more than you should." Jonathan tried to understand what Thomas meant, but the farmer quickly shut down, saying he didn't want to talk about the subject anymore. However, before leaving, Thomas handed him a small sheet of paper with a date and location written hastily, August 14th, 1881, Aberdeen Lake. What Jonathan didn't know was that that date and that location would be crucial in unearthing the deepest layers of truth the city was trying to hide. When he followed Thomas's trail, he wasn't just getting closer to a new secret. He was getting closer to something that could change everything. Furthermore, the city was beginning to react to Jonathan's investigations. The journalist felt even heavier stares upon him, and his interactions with the residents were becoming more challenging. During his visits to the local library, he was confronted with a disconcerting scene. The librarian, an elderly and silent man, seemed surprised to see him enter. When Jonathan inquired about old city archives and records, the librarian hesitated and then closed the book he was reading. "Be careful what you seek, Mr. Miller. Some things once found cannot be erased." This made no sense to Jonathan. Why were the people in Aberdeen so willing to protect whatever was being covered up? Fear was visibly taking hold of the city, as if a dark cloud hung over everyone, and any attempt to dispel it was treated as a threat. Jonathan knew he was getting close to something big and dangerous. With each new clue, each new person he encountered, Mary Elm's case seemed to be just the tip of the iceberg. He was dealing with something much larger, a web of silence, repression, and possibly crimes as old as the city itself. What else could Jonathan discover about Lake Aberdeen and the date Thomas mentioned? And more importantly, what would he do with this information now that he knew he was being closely watched? What do you think Thomas More knows about the true history of Aberdeen? How can Jonathan unravel the connection between the lake and the city's secret? Leave your theories in the comments. Jonathan Miller was already exhausted from chasing clues and talking to people who were clearly trying to stop him from discovering the truth. But the real turning point happened unexpectedly, like a lightning bolt in a dark night, illuminating the path he had been following for so long. Lake Aberdeen. It wasn't just any place. It was directly linked to the city's dark past, and what Jonathan discovered that night would be enough to change his view of everything he had ever learned. After receiving the tip from Thomas More, Jonathan didn't hesitate to head to the lake. It was a warm, humid night, with the full moon reflecting on the water's surface. He was accompanied only by his determination and the feeling that he was finally about to unravel the secret that had kept the city imprisoned for so long. Upon arriving, The atmosphere was sinister. The lake, which by day seemed like a simple tourist attraction in the city, at night became a kind of portal to a dark past. The water was still, almost as if silently waiting for something to happen. Jonathan approached the shore, illuminated only by the faint moonlight, when something caught his attention. There were marks on the earth, as if something had been dragged there. As he walked closer, Jonathan felt a shiver run down his spine. At the bottom of the lake, beneath the dark surface of the water, something glistened. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Something had been there, hidden for years, waiting to be found. With trembling hands, Jonathan plunged into the cold water without hesitation. He knew that whatever he found there would not only confirm all his suspicions, but also put him in a much more dangerous situation. When he finally reached the bottom, his hands closed around a heavy object. With effort, he pulled it out of the water. It was a wooden chest, simple but clearly old. With the chest now before him, Jonathan didn't have the courage to open it immediately. He knew it could be the key to everything he had been searching for, but at the same time, a deep fear paralyzed him. What could he find inside? Ancient relics, documents, or something darker, perhaps even related to Mary Elms's disappearance? That's when he heard a noise behind him. He turned around quickly, his eyes wide. A figure emerged from the shadows, a familiar silhouette. Sheriff Owens. "Do you really believe you can unravel the secrets of Aberdeen, Jonathan?" Owens asked, his voice thick with contempt. His expression was grim, and he was armed. "You were warned not to meddle with the city's past, but now it's too late." Jonathan stood up without hesitation, the trunk still in his hands. "What is this, Owens? What are you trying to hide? I know you have something to do with this. Everyone here has something to hide." The sheriff stepped forward, his piercing gaze fixed on Jonathan. "You still don't understand, kid. This isn't just about what happened to Mary Elms. This is about the town. Everything you see here, all the lies, all the silences, were designed to protect order. If you tear it down, Jonathan, not only will your life be at risk, but everyone around you will be." It was at that moment that Jonathan realized the truth. The city of Aberdeen was not just a small, isolated place. It was a microcosm of a much broader system of control and repression. What the sheriff was advocating was not just silence about the events of one night, but about a much larger pact that involved all the city's residents. They were all in some way caught in a web of silence that extended far beyond Mary Elms and her story. "What happened to her?" Jonathan shouted, anger rising within him. "What did you do to Mary Elms?" Sheriff Owens sighed and took a step closer. "She knew too much. She witnessed something the whole town is trying to forget. And now you, Jonathan, know too much too. You should have stopped when you still could." The tension in the air was palpable. The sheriff began to advance on Jonathan, but at that moment, Jonathan felt no more fear. He knew he couldn't turn back now. He held the key to what lay behind it all, and that meant he had to move forward, no matter the risk. With a swift movement, Jonathan opened the chest. Inside, there were a series of documents, old photos, and a letter yellowed with age. He picked up the letter and read it quickly. It was signed by several of the most powerful figures in the city, including Sheriff Owens himself. The letter spoke of a pact of silence, an agreement among the most influential residents to keep the city under control and hide the truth about what had really happened in Aberdeen's past. "The Aberdeen Pact," Jonathan read under his breath. He felt a chill run down his spine. What he had discovered was not just a story of oppression, it was a story of power, manipulation, and social control, where those who dared to challenge the system were systematically silenced. The sheriff stopped moving, looking directly at Jonathan with a grim expression. He knew that Jonathan now possessed the truth, and that truth, without a doubt, would change everything. "Now that Jonathan has discovered Aberdeen's pact of silence, what do you think he will do with this information? Will he be able to expose the city's secret? Leave your theories and predictions in the comments. The truth was now in Jonathan Miller's hands, but the consequences of his discovery began to spread like wildfire. The pact of silence he had found in the trunk, signed by influential figures in the city, was not just a secret. It was a weapon that could destroy the lives of everyone involved, and his own as well, if he didn't know how to handle the situation. Jonathan's first reaction was a feeling of power. He knew he held something incredibly valuable in his hands, something that could transform his career and, more importantly, liberate the city from the oppressive control that dominated it. But soon a sense of heaviness took hold of his mind. The city, his community, his safety. Everything was now threatened. If he decided to expose the pact, the repercussions would be irreversible. However, fear wasn't the biggest obstacle. The real challenge was dealing with the reactions of the people at the center of the conflict. Those who had signed the pact, who had been manipulating the city for decades, wouldn't be easily defeated. It wasn't just about hiding a secret, but about maintaining a power system that sustained their own lives and their families. If Jonathan opened the chest and revealed the letter, he wouldn't just be exposing a crime, he would be attacking a system of control fundamental to the city's survival. The first to confront him was Sheriff Owens. The next day, Jonathan was awakened in the middle of the night by a loud knock on the door of his small apartment. When he opened it, he was confronted by the sheriff, whose expression was cold and implacable. He entered uninvited, his gaze fixed and full of threats. "I warned you, Jonathan. There's no going back. You got what you wanted. Now listen to me carefully. Either you forget everything you saw and heard, or I'll make sure it never reaches your readers." Jonathan wasn't intimidated, but the intensity of the sheriff's gaze made him hesitate for a moment. Owens wasn't just making an empty threat. He had power, and a frightening amount of influence. "You can try to silence me, Owens, but the truth is here," Jonathan replied, lifting the trunk and showing him the documents. "That's not true, Jonathan," Owens said with a chilling calm. "That's what we call protection. What do you think would happen to the city if everyone knew what really happened? It wouldn't just be a headline. It would destroy Aberdeen. Do you really want to be responsible for that?" Jonathan knew he was being put in a difficult position. Exposing the pact would mean an end to his investigations, but also an end to any peace he might have with the city. On the other hand, remaining silent would mean giving in to the manipulation of the sheriff and all those involved, becoming just another pawn in the web of oppression he was trying to expose. But what weighed most heavily on him was the reaction of the other residents of Aberdeen. How would they react to learning the truth? Conversations with Eliza Parsons and Thomas More, they had shown how divided people were about what to do. Some, like Eliza, had the courage to question the system, but many were so accustomed to the silence that they preferred not to know what was happening. The city, in a way, had been shaped by lies and repression, and revealing the truth could break that structure irreversibly. When Jonathan met with Ellen Harper again, she was the first to express genuine fear. "I know what you found, Jonathan, and I know what it means," she said, her voice trembling. "But you don't understand what's going to happen. The sheriff, he won't stop. He'll do anything to make sure this secret stays buried." Ellen was afraid. She knew that by revealing the truth, they would not only be putting their own future at risk, but dragging everyone around them into a storm that could destroy entire families. "You're not alone in this," she said finally, "but you have to be prepared. The city will never be the same again." Jonathan, however, felt there was no turning back. The truth needed to be told, not only to clear his own conscience, but to give the inhabitants of Aberdeen the opportunity to break free from the cycle of fear and oppression that had held them captive for so long. When Jonathan finally sat down to write his story, he realized the words didn't come as easily as before. The weight of the decision rested on his shoulders. He knew that by writing he wouldn't just be exposing a secret. He would be setting in motion a series of events that would forever change the lives of everyone in Aberdeen. The town, which had seemed so peaceful, was now a battlefield, and the truth was the only weapon he had. Upon finishing the article, Jonathan hesitated before sending it to the newspaper. He knew that after this, nothing would be the same. He couldn't go back. The city was about to be shaken by the truth, and with it, the very social fabric of Aberdeen could disintegrate. Do you think Jonathan made the right decision in deciding to reveal the truth? What would you do in his place? Leave your thoughts in the comments. The moment of revelation came faster than Jonathan Miller had expected. When he woke up the next morning, the city of Aberdeen seemed different, as if the very earth was breathing with a new weight. He had done what he knew was right, but the feeling of having written the truth was more complex than he had imagined. When his article was published, the repercussions began to spread instantly. In the early stages, it seemed that everything was under control. The residents of Aberdeen, like the vast majority, reacted with skepticism and suspicion. Many didn't believe Jonathan's claims, considering him an outsider trying to tarnish the town's reputation. But as the weeks passed, the article began to generate discussion. People started to question, talk, and reflect on what was really happening behind the scenes in the small town. For Jonathan, the biggest challenge wasn't facing the direct threats from Sheriff Owens or the pressure from the powerful. The real challenge was dealing with the way the town began to regroup, as if the article were the starting point for an inevitable confrontation. People who had been silent began to rise up, but not everyone was prepared for the change. The division that existed among the residents of Aberdeen was now exposed, and there was no going back. Jonathan saw the effect of his words on people's behavior. Eliza Parsons Shee, who until then had been a peripheral figure in his investigation, became a point of support for those who wished to challenge the power structure that had remained silent for so long. She was one of the first to approach Jonathan after the post, with a determined expression on her face. "I knew you would do this, Jonathan," Eliza said, her voice thick with genuine emotion. "I knew the truth had to come out, but I didn't know how. Now, everything is about to change, not just for you, but for all of us." But with the arrival of the conflict, Jonathan soon realized that Eliza was also undergoing a transformation. She was learning to challenge herself, to understand the cost of truth and the responsibility that came with it. What had previously seemed like a fight for freedom was now becoming a psychological confrontation. She was no longer just facing the powerful figures of the city, but also her own courage to confront the repercussions of what she had helped to create. As Eliza began to assume a leadership role, Jonathan faced his own inner demons. He knew he had done the right thing by exposing the truth, but he also knew the consequences were far heavier than he had imagined. The threats continued. Sheriff Owens was more aggressive than ever, and the people he considered allies were now in danger. The city of Aberdeen was dividing in ways Jonathan had never foreseen. There were those who wanted to fight the system, those who sought a new order, and there were those who feared what change might bring. Fear hung in the air like a shadow, looming over every decision, every move. What had seemed like a one-man battle against the system was now becoming a social, political, and psychological confrontation that affected everyone. And it was during this moment of crisis that Thomas Moore, he stepped back into the scene. After weeks of apparent seclusion, the farmer finally sought out Jonathan with the expression of someone who had reached his breaking point. He knew his loyalty to Sheriff Owens was about to be questioned, but the truth had caught up with him in a way he could no longer ignore. "I'm not a man who likes controversy," Thomas began, his voice low and full of regret. "But I was complicit, Jonathan. I saw what was happening, and I never did anything. And now, after everything you've revealed, I can't continue to watch in silence." Thomas then revealed something Jonathan hadn't expected. He had witnessed secret meetings where Sheriff Owens and other local leaders discussed ways to control the town through fear and manipulation. He was somehow involved in the Pact of Silence itself, but his recent distancing from Aberdeen's powerful figures wasn't just due to distrust. He had begun to question the role he played. If you want to know the truth, Jonathan, I can help. But you need to understand that exposing this will cost you more than you imagine. It's not just the sheriff you'll be facing. What's at stake now is the very future of Aberdeen. Jonathan felt an immense weight upon hearing Thomas's words. He knew that deep down, the city would never be the same. The truths were exposed, and although he had won a battle by revealing the Pact of Silence, the real war was only beginning. Much more needed to be done to change the system that governed the city, and more importantly, to transform those who were accustomed to living in the shadow of oppression. In the following days, Jonathan found himself more than ever torn between the desire to expose more and the responsibility of dealing with the consequences. He felt the mounting pressure from all sides. On one side, the threats from Owens and his allies, and on the other, the clamour for justice and change coming from the ordinary citizens of Aberdeen, who were now beginning to question their own role in the system they had tolerated for so long. Jonathan realized that his real struggle wasn't just about bringing the truth to light. His internal battle was against the feeling of powerlessness in the face of the greater forces still at play. He needed to become more than just a journalist. He needed to be a leader, someone who could inspire real change, someone who, like Eliza, not only challenged the system but knew how to reform it. He gazed at the horizon where the future of Aberdeen was being rewritten. It wouldn't be easy, but he knew the fight for justice was a marathon, not a sprint, and he was ready to continue. Do you think Jonathan is becoming a true leader, or is he still stuck on the idea of just being a journalist? What does he need to do to transform the city of Aberdeen in a lasting way? Leave your opinions in the comments. Tension in Aberdeen had reached a boiling point. After the publication of Jonathan Miller's article and the subsequent revelations, the city would never be the same. What had seemed like a small, isolated town where everyone knew and supported each other was now transforming into a minefield of distrust and fear. But at the same time, a sense of anticipation hung in the air, as if everyone knew that the end of an era was approaching. Jonathan knew that to continue his fight, he needed to align all aspects of his investigation and his support network. The city was dividing into factions, those who wanted radical change and those who preferred to keep things as they were, protecting the secrets that sustained their power. The real battle was being waged not only in the newspaper, but in the streets, in the homes, and in the lives of everyone who had been affected by the repression. Eliza Parsons, now a key figure in the resistance, was in contact with other residents willing to fight against the system. She had formed a small group composed of people like Thomas More and other citizens who, over the years, had begun to question the injustices of Aberdeen. But the pressure against them was intensifying. Sheriff Owens and his allies had begun to act more aggressively. The fear of an imminent confrontation hung over everyone, and what had once been a silent struggle was now becoming open warfare. Jonathan, now more than ever, found himself at the center of it all. He knew he could no longer stand on the sidelines, observing. He needed to make a crucial decision. Either he acted decisively and brought about the change the city needed, or he withdrew and allowed the system to consolidate itself, as had happened so many times before. That day, Jonathan met with Eliza, and the other members of the resistance group gathered in a safe place, an old house in the center of town that seemed to be on the fringes of the prying eyes of Aberdeen's powerful figures. There they discussed their options. They had enough evidence to challenge the sheriff and expose the network of control that governed the town, but they knew that by doing so, the consequences would be irreversible. "We can't wait any longer," Eliza said, her voice firm but full of concern. "We're in the sheriff's hands, and this can't go on. The truth needs to be revealed to everyone, but we need to act fast. The sheriff won't let this go." Thomas Moore, sitting next to Eliza, nodded in agreement. "I'm with you. I know my past doesn't put me in a favorable position, but now, more than ever, the city needs to know the truth." Jonathan looked at the faces around him. He knew that if they made that decision, there would be no turning back. The game he had started had consequences that could forever change not only his life, but the lives of everyone in Aberdeen. He was ready to face what was to come, but he knew that resistance had its limitations. "I'm not here to wage war," Jonathan said, his voice deep. "I'm here to give the city a chance to change. The exhibition is the first step, but we need a clear plan. The sheriff will come after us, and the whole city will be transformed. We won't back down." Eliza stood up and approached Jonathan, placing her hand on his shoulder. "This is more than just you and me, Jonathan. Now it's the whole town. They need to see what's happening. Everyone needs to know the truth." Jonathan felt the force of his words, and he knew there was no escape. He could no longer hide behind the investigation. The fight had become personal, and he was ready to face the repercussions of his actions, but he couldn't do it alone. The plan was set. Jonathan and the resistance group would meet with some of their key allies within the city, people who were still willing to fight against repression and corruption. They needed to make the truth heard. And to do that, they needed to ensure that Jonathan's newspaper, with its evidence and documents, was disseminated to as many people as possible. But before everything was set in motion, Jonathan knew he needed to prepare for Sheriff Owens's reaction. The sheriff wasn't going to let a fight go unchallenged. He had power, and that power could be devastating. The city was on the verge of transformation, but this last move might be the riskiest of all. As the days passed, the city of Aberdeen breathed an unbearable tension. The streets, once tranquil, were now filled with rumors and whispered conversations. Every move of Jonathan and his allies was being watched. The truth was about to be revealed. But what would happen next? The game was almost over. Jonathan and his allies were ready to act. But what would happen when the truth finally came out? Could the city withstand the pressure of its own secrets? Now that Jonathan is preparing to face the truth, what do you think will happen when he confronts Sheriff Owens? Will the city of Aberdeen be able to change? Leave your opinions and predictions in the comments. It was the day when everything would happen. The weight of the decision had been on Jonathan Miller's shoulders for weeks, but now he felt the moment was about to arrive, and the consequences would be inevitable. He no longer had time to hesitate. The truth had been revealed, but the city of Aberdeen was still blind, divided, and on the verge of collapse. Now, he needed to take the final step, the boldest step of his life. Jonathan and the members of the resistance had meticulously planned everything. Jonathan's newspaper was ready, and the documents exposing the pact of silence and the manipulation of power by Sheriff Owens and his allies were ready to be delivered to the public. They would use the newspaper as their weapon, a special publication that contained all the evidence, signatures and photos, detailing every betrayal and lie that had kept the city under control for so long. Eliza, Thomas and the others were prepared to help. They had a plan to secretly distribute copies of the newspaper through the streets, ensuring the truth reached everyone without the sheriff having a chance to silence them. But as the day approached, Jonathan sensed something was about to happen. The tension was palpable. He knew that by exposing everything, he risked not only his own life, but also the lives of everyone around him. That afternoon, while the city prepared for the event, Jonathan met with Sheriff Owens once again. They hadn't seen each other since their last encounter, when the sheriff had threatened Jonathan and tried to intimidate him. Now, Jonathan knew Owens was angrier than ever, and it wasn't just about the article. He felt his authority was being challenged, and the truth could destroy his career and his control over Aberdeen. Jonathan walked to the sheriff's office, where he was greeted with a cold, menacing expression. Owens sat behind his desk, his posture rigid, as if he already knew what was about to happen. "I knew you would do this, Jonathan," Owens said, his voice low but thick with anger. "Do you think you can just destroy everything we've built here? Do you think you can just destroy Aberdeen?" Jonathan wasn't intimidated. He was there to do what he knew was right. "It's not up to you to decide what happens here, Sheriff. You're trying to keep everyone quiet, but the truth will come out whether you like it or not." Owens stood up abruptly, advancing toward Jonathan, but the journalist did not back down. "You really don't understand, do you? Aberdeen is not like other cities, Jonathan. What's at stake here isn't just power. What's at stake is the future of our city, our survival. You have no idea what will happen when you reveal this truth." Jonathan maintained a steady gaze. "I know very well what's going on here, and that's why the city needs to know. People need to know who you really are." The tension between the two was unbearable. Jonathan knew he couldn't do this alone, and that Owens had the power to destroy him. But what he didn't know was that the sheriff was about to play his last trick. In one swift movement, Owens pulled a gun from his drawer and pointed it at Jonathan. "Do you really think you can mess with us and get away with it?" Owens growled. "This is the end for you, Jonathan. If you publish this, you'll never see the light of day again. What's about to happen is going to be more than you can handle." Jonathan felt sweat trickling down his forehead, but he remained calm. He knew that, at that moment, the only way out was to do what he had planned. He could no longer be afraid. The truth lay far beyond his own fear or the safety of his life. "You can try to silence me, Sheriff, but the truth is already out in the streets, and you can't hide it anymore," Jonathan replied, his eyes fixed on the gun pointed at him. Before Owens could react, the office door opened, and Eliza Thomas and the other members of the resistance entered suddenly, breaking the tension in the air. They were there with a determined attitude. "It's over, Sheriff," Eliza said in a firm voice. "The town will know the truth. There's no more room for lies." Jonathan's allies had managed to distribute the newspapers throughout the city, and now, while the sheriff was trying to recover from the shock, the evidence was in everyone's hands. The truth had come out, and now there was no turning back. Owens looked at the faces around him, realizing he had lost control. He knew his empire was about to crumble, and although he had tried to fight until the very last moment, there was no way to hide the secrets any longer. The resistance had won. Jonathan and his allies had exposed the truth to the world. With one last glance, Owens lowered his weapon. He knew his era of power was over, but what remained for him now? Would he be brought to justice, or would he simply become a reminder of a past the city had finally managed to overcome? Jonathan, on the other hand, felt that the battle was won. The city of Aberdeen now knew the truth. But what would happen next? The resistance had won, but the future of Aberdeen was still uncertain. Now that the truth has finally been revealed, how do you think the city of Aberdeen will react? What will the consequences be for Sheriff Owens and the residents who were part of the Pact of Silence? Leave your predictions in the comments. The city of Aberdeen would never be the same again. What was once a small community of secrets was now transforming into a place where the truth could finally breathe. The streets, once the stage for whispers and suspicious glances, were now filled with open conversations. Although the process was painful and full of uncertainties, the city was beginning to heal its wounds, little by little. The impact of the revelations was profound, but also liberating. Jonathan Miller, the man who uncovered the secret plaguing Aberdeen, was no longer the same. He had faced fear, corruption, and intimidation, and had emerged victorious. But he knew that this victory did not come without its cost. People like Sheriff Owens, those who once ruled the city with an iron fist, were now under investigation, and the city was organizing to face the consequences of years of oppression. The city's powerful figures, who had taken advantage of the silence imposed by everyone, now faced the possibility of being judged. their lies and manipulations exposed. But the truth brought not only justice, it also brought pain. Many families were divided, with children rising up against parents, friends becoming enemies, and relationships shattered by the reality of what had happened. What was perhaps most cruel was realizing that not everyone was ready for change. There were those who still wanted to cling to the past, still willing to protect the lies that kept them in a false state of security. Eliza Parsons. She was one of the first to realize that although the battle had been won, rebuilding Aberdeen would take longer than she had imagined. The city was broken, but not without hope. Now what comes next is a new challenge, Eliza told Jonathan in a private meeting days after the revelations. It's not enough to just expose the truth. We have to rebuild the city, help people cope with what happened, and guide Aberdeen toward a future where transparency and justice are the cornerstones. Jonathan knew she was right. What began as a personal struggle against silence and oppression was now becoming a movement for transformation. He felt tired but also stronger. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could help write a new future for Aberdeen. As he gazed at the horizon, Jonathan finally felt ready to move forward. The truth had been exposed, and now the city had a chance to rebuild. The road would be long, and the challenges many, but for the first time in years, there was hope. With the truth finally revealed, what do you think will be the next steps for Jonathan and the city of Aberdeen? What can be done to heal the wounds that remain? Leave your ideas in the comments. Months after the revelations, the city of Aberdeen began to breathe new air. The scars were still visible, but the healing process had begun. Jonathan Miller became an important figure in the city's reconstruction, not only as a journalist, but as a champion of truth and justice. Sheriff Owens was finally held accountable for his crimes, and the city organized itself to ensure that oppression would never again be tolerated. Aberdeen's past was now part of history, but the future was being written in a more open and honest way, with renewed hope for all. What do you think the future holds for Jonathan and the city of Aberdeen now that justice has been served? How do you imagine the city transforming in the coming years? Leave your predictions in the comments. If you enjoyed this story and are curious to learn more about what happens in cities like Aberdeen, share your thoughts with us in the comments. What do you think Jonathan could do now to ensure the city stays on the path of justice? How do you imagine Aberdeen's future? And if you've faced similar challenges in your life, how would you react if you were in Jonathan's place? Don't forget to follow for more exciting stories and tell us what you thought of this plot full of mystery and twists.